The town of Hollow Creek was lost to time. Tucked away in the folds of a forgotten valley, it was a place where shadows lingered long after the sun had set, especially on Halloween night. This year, a blanket of fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the town whole. A silence had descended upon Hollow Creek, broken only by the rustle of dead leaves skittering down the deserted streets. The old houses stood like watchful sentinels, their hollow eyes reflecting the ghostly glow of the moon. The air was heavy with anticipation, a silent symphony of suspense waiting for its crescendo. Even the wind, usually a mischievous sprite weaving through the town, seemed to hold its breath. It was as if Hollow Creek itself was holding its breath, bracing for something ominous, something ancient to stir. High on a hill overlooking the town stood the Thornwell residence. A Victorian mansion, once grand, now stood shrouded in an air of melancholy and decay. The paint peeled, the gingerbread trim was slowly rotting, and the once vibrant garden was now a graveyard of withered blooms. Inside, the Thornwell family was gathered in the living room. John Thornwell, a man weathered by hardship, sat by the fireplace attempting to read. His wife, Eleanor, a woman whose youthful beauty was now etched with worry lines, was knitting nervously. Their daughter, Lily, a precocious girl of 10 with eyes that shone with intelligence and fear, stared at the old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging rhythmically, counting down the seconds to some unseen doom. The silence of the room was shattered by a low hum, barely audible at first, like a distant radio station struggling to find a signal. It emanated from the walls, a steady rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into the very bones of the house. John frowned, lowering his newspaper. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor stopped knitting, her needles poised in midair. "Hear what, dear?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "That humming sound," John replied, his gaze sweeping the room, searching for the source of the strange noise. Lily, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear, slid closer to her parents. The hum grew steadily louder, a constant throbbing presence that seemed to pulsate in time with their quickening heartbeats. It was as if the house itself was waking up from a long, deep sleep. "It's probably just the old wiring," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "This house is ancient." But even as she spoke, her words lacked conviction. There was something unnerving about the sound, something that sent shivers crawling down their spines. The humming intensified, spreading throughout the house like a virus. The air grew heavy, charged with static electricity. Shadows seemed to writhe and dance in the corners of the room, their movements mirroring the growing fear in the hearts of the Thornwell family. The grandfather clock in the corner, silent for years, suddenly sprang to life. Its pendulum swung wildly, its chimes echoing through the house, each clang like the tolling of a funeral bell. Lily screamed, burying her face in her mother's lap. Then the furniture started to move. The armchairs shifted slightly, as if occupied by unseen guests. The heavy oak dining table shuddered, its surface rattling with unseen energy. Paintings on the walls tilted at odd angles, their subjects seeming to stare accusingly at the terrified family huddled in the center of the room. Trapped. John, his face pale but resolute, pulled his family towards the front door. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. But as he reached for the doorknob, it turned icy cold beneath his touch. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding them captive. Panic flared in Eleanor's eyes. "John, it's locked!" she cried, her voice high-pitched and frantic. She rattled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The humming reached a fever pitch. vibrating through the house with a force that seemed to shake it to its very foundations. The temperature plummeted, sending a wave of icy air through the room. The air grew thick with the stench of mildew and decay, the smell of something ancient and evil. Suddenly, the wallpaper in the living room began to peel away from the walls, as if an invisible hand was ripping it down. The plaster beneath crumbled, revealing a gaping maw of darkness behind the walls. In the flickering light of the fireplace, the darkness seemed to writhe and pulse. Then, with a deafening crack that seemed to split the night in two, the walls of the house groaned inward. The Thornwells screamed, shielding their eyes from the dust and debris. When they looked up, their blood ran cold. Where the living room wall once stood, a monstrous form was taking shape. It was a grotesque parody of a human face, formed from the very timbers and bricks of the house, its eyes, two glowing embers of malevolent energy, fixed on the terrified family. The house hungers. The house, no longer content to simply whisper and moan, now roared its hunger. The monstrous face in the wall lunged forward, its maw opening wide to reveal rows of jagged nails and splintered wood that served as teeth. This was no ordinary haunting. This was the house itself, transformed into a predator, and the Thornwells were its prey. John, fear momentarily forgotten in a surge of protectiveness, shoved his family behind him. "Run!" he roared, his voice hoarse with terror. "Get out of the house!" Eleanor scooped Lily into her arms and made a dash for the back door, but as she fumbled with the lock, the house shuddered violently. The floor tilted beneath their feet, sending them sprawling, fleeing into the night. Lily, small and agile, scrambled to her feet and slipped through the narrow opening of the back door. "Mummy, Daddy, come on!" she cried, her voice a desperate plea lost in the howling wind. Eleanor, her ankle twisted beneath her, reached out a hand to her daughter. But before she could grab hold, the monstrous face in the wall lunged again. John, with a cry of despair, threw himself in front of his wife, shielding her from the creature's attack. Lily watched in horror as the house consumed her father. The last thing she saw before she turned and ran was the look of pure terror on her mother's face as the house closed in on her, its monstrous jaws snapping shut with a sickening crunch. A sole survivor. Lily didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek. She didn't dare look back, her mind refusing to accept the horrors she had witnessed. The image of her parents, swallowed whole by the monstrous house, was seared into her memory. She stumbled through the fog-choked streets, her small body racked with sobs. The townsfolk, if there were any left in Hollow Creek, remained hidden in their homes, their doors bolted against the terror that stalked the night. Lily, alone and afraid, was the sole survivor of the night the Thornwell house had come alive. She was a tiny flicker of life in a town consumed by darkness, a solitary witness to the hunger that lurked beneath the floorboards and behind the walls of Hollow Creek. The static remains. Years later, long after the events of that horrific Halloween night, the legend of the Thornwell house lived on in hushed whispers. The house itself remained, a decaying monument to the darkness that had claimed the Thornwells. Some say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, a low, steady hum emanating from the walls of the abandoned house on the hill. A hum that speaks of an ancient hunger, a hunger that was never satisfied, a hunger that waits patiently for its next victims. The static in the walls of Hollow Creek, a constant reminder of the night the town's silence turned deadly.